Epilepsy monitoring, as you know, it's tough,
Right.
really tough. Just knowing when seizures happen, how often, it's a huge challenge.
Right. Patient diaries, self-reports. They're helpful, but they don't always catch everything, do they?
Not by a long shot. They're just not reliably accurate on their own.
And that seems to be where this Minder system comes in. Your sources paint it as a potential new way to get that long-term continuous brain data, the EEG data, but less invasively than some current methods.
That's the idea. Less invasive than, say, intracranial electrodes placed directly in the brain.
Okay. And the Umpire study is sort of the proving ground for this, the first real test.
A crucial first step, yeah, first in human trial, looking specifically at that initial safety and, does it actually work as intended, the performance.
Got it. So let's start right there. Based purely on your sources, what is this Minder system, technically speaking? And what was the Umpire study's basic setup?
Okay, so the Minder system itself, your sources describe it as a bilateral subscalp EEG acquisition system.
Bilateral subscope. Okay, break that down.
Right. Subscalp means it's implanted just under the skin of the scalp, minimally invasive. And bilateral, that's the really key part here, records continuously from both sides of the head, left and right.
Okay. So not just one spot, but covering both hemispheres continuously over the long term.
Exactly. And the Umpire study was the vehicle to test that in people for the first time.
How many people? How long did it run?
It was what they call a prospective, multi-center trial. Involved 26 adults, and they completed a full 6-month follow-up period.
And the main goal was checking if it was safe, if it was feasible to use.
Primarily, yes. Safety and feasibility over those 6 months.
Okay, right. Now, this is where I think it starts to get really interesting. What did the study actually show about the system's strengths? What did it seem to do well in this initial run?
Well, first and foremost, safety. That's always paramount with any new implantable device.
And the results looked good on that front.
They did. Your sources emphasize a pretty robust safety profile over the 6 months. Specifically, they reported an absence of any serious adverse events related to the device itself or the implant procedure. No deaths either.
That's obviously huge. What about less serious issues? Any side effects?
The most common things were mild or moderate pain, like at the implant site.
Yeah.
That affected about 35% of the patients.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that your sources note these rates were actually lower than what's been reported for older unilateral subscalp systems.
Lower than previous tech. That's promising.
It is. And another really positive safety point. None of the devices had to be taken out or reimplanted during the study period.
Oh, that's significant too. Suggests it's pretty stable once it's in.
Right. It contrasts well with some earlier systems that apparently had higher reoperation rates. They also looked at lead stability, how much the implanted wires moved.
Did they move much?
Very little, actually. An average displacement of just 5.7 millimeters. And crucially, that small movement didn't seem to impair the quality of the signal they were getting.
So the space under the scalp seems like a good, stable spot for this kind of thing?
It suggests that, yes, the subgaleal space, technically.
Okay, so safety looks like a tick in the box for this initial study. What about actually doing its job capturing the brain's electrical activity? Signal capture, signal clarity.
Also quite positive, according to your materials. They did a direct comparison during periods when patients also had standard scalp video EEG monitoring, or VEM.
The kind usually done in hospital for a few days.
Exactly. And they found that basically all the key neurophysiological events they saw on the scalp VEM, things like sleep spindles, chewing artifacts, those between seizure spikes called IEDs.
Interictal epileptiform discharges.
Right. And actual electrographic seizures, the electrical signature of a seizure, all those were successfully picked up by the subscalp recordings too.
So it captured the same events. Was the signal quality comparable or even better?
This is another point your sources highlight. When they rated the clarity of the seizure signal subjectively, the subscalp EEG scored significantly higher than the 2-channel scalp recordings they used for comparison during VEM.
Significantly higher. Wow.
Yeah, the median score was the same, a 3, but statistically the difference was significant. They quote a p-value of 0.0025, which is, highly unlikely to be chance.
Okay, and clarity for other signals.
Comparable. So for seizures at least, it seemed to offer a clearer view in this comparison.
Now, let's circle back to that bilateral aspect you mentioned, recording from both sides. Your sources seem to call this a potential game changer. Why is that so important?
It really is a major advancement flagged in the papers. Think about it. If you're only monitoring one side of the head,
You could miss something happening on the other side.
completely miss it, especially if it's a seizure that starts and stays on one side, or if someone has independent seizure activity starting in both hemispheres. Bilateral coverage is designed to catch that.
Okay, so it gives a more complete picture. Did the study actually find instances where this made a clinical difference?
Yes, your sources state that this bilateral capability revealed clinically relevant information stuff they wouldn't have gotten from a unilateral recording in a notable number of patients. 6 out of the 26, which is about 23%.
Really, a quarter of them. What kind of information?
Things like helping clarify which side seizures were really starting on when previous tests were unclear, or in some cases, detecting seizures starting independently on both sides when that wasn't suspected before. It really adds diagnostic value.
Right. It moves beyond just signal detection. How else did the study suggest this might be useful clinically for diagnosis or treatment planning?
Well, overall, they identified clinically relevant electrographic findings, those important brain patterns, in the vast majority of patients. 23 out of 26, so that's 88%.
That's a high hit rate for useful info.
It is. And it wasn't just one type of seizure. The system captured seizures originating from a diverse range of locations in the brain. So the potential isn't just counting seizures, it's about refining the diagnosis.
Like figuring out exactly where seizures start.
Potentially, yes.
Mhm.
Helping clarify tricky cases, maybe even helping assess if someone's suitable for epilepsy surgery by pinpointing seizure onset zones better than standard methods sometimes can.
Your sources mentioned a specific case, didn't they? Something about behavior.
Yes, that was a compelling example. In one patient, the system apparently identified seizures happening at the same time as episodes of aggressive behavior. This helped resolve uncertainty about whether the behavior was seizure-related or not.
So the continuous EEG provided objective evidence linking the two.
Exactly. It's the kind of clinical puzzle that patient reports alone, or even short VEM stays, might not solve.
Speaking of patient reports, let's talk about that issue of seizure diaries again. We know they can be inaccurate. Did this study add more evidence to that?
Oh, absolutely. The numbers provided in your sources are quite striking. During the time patients had simultaneous VEM, a full 56%, more than half of the electrographic seizures captured on EEG, were not reported by the patients in their diaries.
Wow. Half the seizures just missed in the diary.
Unreported, yes. And then look at the flip side. During those same VEM periods, patients reported 84 events in their diaries that turned out not to be seizures on the EEG,
84 non-seizure events reported.
compared to only 11 actual electrographic seizures that they did report correctly during that limited VEM window.
So lots of false alarms in the diaries and lots of missed seizures. Really highlights the discrepancy.
It really does.
Okay, so even though the Minder system wasn't recording perfectly 100% of the time for everyone over the 6 months you mentioned, average data availability was around 53%.
That's the figure they reported, yes. 53% mean availability.
Even with that, it's still capturing vastly more data than a typical 3 or 5 day VEM stay in the hospital, right?
That's the argument your sources make. Even intermittent use over months provides a much more extensive and arguably more ecologically valid, meaning representative of real-life picture of seizure patterns compared to diaries or short hospital stays.
More data, more context. And one last strength mentioned, it's subscalp, so it's considered minimally invasive.
Correct. Compared to putting electrodes deep inside the brain tissue, which carries different risks, that's a key advantage for this type of system.
Okay, so a lot of positives in this initial assessment. Safety, the signal quality, that crucial bilateral coverage, potential diagnostic utility, and providing way more objective data than diaries.
Mhm.
But every study has limitations, especially a first-in-human one. What did this study not fully answer? What are the caveats here, according to your sources, that affect how we view the validity of its performance?
Right. Perspective is important. This was promising, but it's early days. The most obvious limitation, common in these trials, is the small sample size. Just 26 patients.
Fine for initial safety, but hard to generalize.
Exactly. It limits how confident we can be that these results apply to everyone with epilepsy, given the condition's diversity.
Makes sense. What about more specific limitations related to assessing how accurate the device actually is at detecting seizures over the long term?
This is probably the biggest caveat your sources point out, and it relates to how the data was reviewed.
How so?
Well, the experts didn't review the entire 6 months of continuous subscalp EEG data for every patient looking for every potential seizure. Instead, they only reviewed the subscalp data during very specific time windows.
Which windows?
Times when a seizure was already marked on the simultaneous scalp VM,
Yep.
or times when the patient logged an event in their diary.
Ah, I see. So they weren't doing an independent, comprehensive review of the Minder data itself to find all the events it might have detected.
Precisely. And the crucial consequence of doing it that way, as your sources state, is that it precluded any systematic assessment of false positives.
Meaning they couldn't tell how often the Minder system might have flagged something as a seizure when it actually wasn't one.
Correct. We just don't have data on the false positive rate from this study design.
And presumably, it also meant they couldn't do a full analysis of all those unreported seizures outside the short VEM periods either.
That's also true. They couldn't get a comprehensive picture of the true burden of unreported seizures over the full 6 months using this review method. Your sources are clear that these kinds of analyses assessing true positives, false positives, and the full unreported seizure burden based on a complete data review are planned for future studies.
Okay, so that's a major limitation for validating long-term detection accuracy. What else?
Another point was the relatively small number of actual seizures captured during that VEM comparison period. Only 25 seizures across 8 participants.
And that limited.
It limited their ability to really dig into certain things, like whether that small amount of lead migration they observed had any subtle impact on the seizure signal quality captured by Minder. Not enough data points for that detailed analysis.
Understood. And there was something about how the scalp EEG was analyzed for the comparison, too.
Yes. The sources mentioned that the comparison scalp VEM data was initially screened using a commercial detection algorithm, not by a neurologist meticulously reviewing every second of it.
Okay, and the potential issue there.
The concern raised is that an algorithm might miss some subtle or very brief focal seizures on the scalp EEG that a human expert might catch. If that happened, it could potentially inflate the perceived advantage of the subscalp system's detection or clarity.
Makes a subscalp look better if the comparison standard wasn't perfect. Got it.
It's a potential confounding factor, they acknowledge.
You also mentioned the variability in data availability earlier, that 53% average, but ranging from 0 to almost 100%.
Right. That significant variability, 53% aneuploidy and 25% range, now as 97%, is noted as a limitation affecting data completeness and how representative it is.
Were there reasons given for the really low completeness in some cases?
Yes. Your sources mentioned 2 patients specifically where data acquisition was considered a failure. In one case, the patient had cognitive impairment that made it hard for them to consistently use the external part of the system.
And the other?
The other had a particularly thick scalp, which apparently prevented a reliable magnetic connection between the external device and the implanted lead.
Ah, so the technology itself has a physical limitation there. The magnet needs to connect through the skin.
Exactly. And they also speculate that because participants didn't get any feedback on their recordings during the study, they didn't know if they were capturing data correctly or not. They might have reduced motivation for consistent use.
Which could contribute to data gaps and make the results less reflective of ideal real-world usage.
Potentially, yes. It impacts that ecological validity.
One last point on limitations. Even with the Minder system providing objective data, the study still showed issues with what patients were reporting in their diaries, didn't it?
Yes, reinforcing the self-report challenge. Your sources note that around 69% of the events patients did log in their diaries during the VEM periods were not actually associated with any electrographic seizure activity on the subscalp recording.
So even when trying their best, there's still a lot of noise in patient diaries.
It just underscores how difficult subjective reporting is, even when you have simultaneous objective monitoring happening.
Okay, so pulling all this together now, the strengths, the limitations, what's the big picture takeaway from your sources on the Umpire study and this Minder system at this stage?
Well, the main conclusion seems to be that Umpire provides pretty strong initial evidence for the safety of the Minder system and also for its initial performance validity, meaning the technology itself, the bilateral capture, the signal clarity it works.
It seems like a significant step forward, especially that bilateral aspect.
It does. However, the validity of its comprehensive long-term seizure detection accuracy, how well it truly counts and characterizes seizures over months, it's still somewhat qualified.
Qualified by those limitations you mentioned. The way the data was reviewed, the completeness issues.
Exactly. This study wasn't designed or analyzed to give the final answer on its automated detection performance over the full 6 months.
Which means, essentially,
It means this was a vital and very promising first step, showing the device is safe and the core tech functions well. But further studies are definitely needed.
larger studies, studies with different analysis methods.
Both, ideally. Larger trials, and critically, trials that involve a full systematic review of all the continuous data to properly assess both true positive and false positive detection rates over the long term. That's needed for full validation.
Right. So Safe, tech works, shows promise, especially bilaterally. But the final verdict on long-term standalone accuracy needs more research.
That sums it up nicely based on these sources.
Okay, well, we've definitely gone through the material you sent over. You asked us to do a deep dive into these notes and papers on Umpire and Minder, and hopefully we've pulled out those key insights for you.
The safety data, the potential of that bilateral monitoring, the stark reminder about self-report limits.
And those important caveats about what this specific study can and can't tell us about long-term accuracy just yet.
It really does feel like it could represent a potential shift, though, towards monitoring that's less invasive, much longer term, and maybe more complete than what's often possible now.
And thinking about that potential shift, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, building on these sources. If this kind of continuous bilateral brain activity data becomes more common, more accessible outside of just short hospital stays,
Mhm.
how might that change things fundamentally?
Hmm.
Not just for diagnosis or picking treatments, but how might it change how people with epilepsy actually understand their own condition? Seeing the objective data, perhaps beyond just the seizures they feel or count.
That's a powerful question. What else might we learn? What patterns might emerge? When we can essentially watch brain activity unfold, uninterrupted, for months or even years, it opens up a lot of possibilities.